Well, if you're looking for companies with exposure in Southeast Asia, you're not going to find many in Hong Kong because the logical place for companies based in Hong Kong when they expand outside is to go to mainland China. Right? If you're looking for Southeast Asian companies, you should be looking in Southeast Asia. And that means Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, maybe even Vietnam. So if you want Southeast Asian exposure, don't look at Hong Kong. If you want Chinese exposure, Hong Kong's a good place to look. If you have access to the A-share market in China, that's another place to look. In terms of the makeup in Hong Kong, yes, there's a lot of large real estate companies, a lot of large financials, but that's true in any economy. Real estate, in any capitalist economy, you're going to have real estate, you're going to have financials, you're going to have utilities, you're going to have transport companies. It's not really all that different. The difference in Hong Kong is that you essentially have two groups of companies. One group, which are mainly so-called domestic companies. Most of the operations are in Hong Kong, and maybe they have a little bit outside. Right? These are your so-called normal domestic companies. And then the other group would actually be the Chinese companies, which happen to be listed in Hong Kong. The largest of whom, of course, are the state-owned companies like the banks, right? The big four, ABC, CCB, ICBC, and ABC, ICBC, CCB, and what's the last one? Agricultural Bank, China Construction Bank, ICBC, Bank of China, sorry. So that's four. Right? And likewise, the three telcos, right? China Unicom, China Telecom, China Mobile, etc., right? So you get Cement and what have you. Basically, all these guys are listed in Hong Kong. So you can, if you want to buy a significant proportion of Chinese GDP or get exposure to Chinese GDP through Hong Kong if you want to, or if you want to, you can also just get exposure mainly to Hong Kong's GDP through Hong Kong companies.
And would these companies be the so-called H shares?
Yes, these are the so-called H shares. That's right. Yeah. So, for example, the four banks I mentioned, they're all listed in the Shanghai market, in the A share market, but they're also listed in Hong Kong in the so-called H share market. Yeah. And there are some companies, so these are so-called dual listings, right? They're listed both in Shanghai and in Hong Kong. And there's actually one, which is a railway company, which is triple listed. It's listed, in the US as well. It has an ADR. As well as a H share listing, as well as an A share listing. In Hong Kong, actually, we have a fair amount of exposure to retailers, specifically cosmetics retailers. I think these guys have an edge in the sense that for retailing, there's a lot of arbitrage because of the residents in southern China. A lot of them actually buy these products and they go home and they resell them, and the reason is because Hong Kong allows parallel imports, and so it's actually possible to buy branded cosmetic goods at significant discounts to the so-called list price. And China does not allow parallel imports, which means that everything you buy in China essentially is sold at the official price. And in China, there's also a value-added tax of 17%, and so there's actually a significant difference. And so there is actually a meaningful amount of arbitrage being done by so-called day trippers who come to Hong Kong, buy a bunch of cosmetics, and then they go home and sell it in Swensen, for example. And that's actually been very beneficial for some of the cosmetics retailers in Hong Kong. Singapore is obviously different from Hong Kong in the sense that there is no obvious hinterland. In Hong Kong, the moment they try to expand, the first place they look is China. And so you see a lot of manufacturing companies that started in China, but basically moved across the border about 10, 20 years ago. And so a lot of their factories are in Shenzhen or Dongguan, in the Guangdong province. In Singapore, if they went overseas, well, they often went to Malaysia or Indonesia, and sometimes they went to China themselves. One of the differences is that Hong Kong didn't get the same type of multinational investment that Singapore received. And that's made a difference. In Singapore, because you have a lot of multinational companies investing here, the kind of companies that tend to spring up tend to be suppliers, for example. The OEM suppliers, for example, to the hard disk drive industry. Whereas in Hong Kong, you don't have this because the multinationals didn't put a plant in Hong Kong to begin with. The population density also in Hong Kong is higher than Singapore, which also has implications for foot traffic. And so what you see, or at least what I've seen, is that in Hong Kong, even though the rents on a per square foot basis are higher than in Singapore, the foot traffic is actually much higher. And so the retailers actually still make money, whereas in Singapore, the retailers tend to struggle quite a bit. But one of the differences is that in Singapore, the banking sector is quite heavily consolidated. There are essentially only 3 large local banks. There were more some time ago, but the government decided, I think more than a decade ago, that basically Singapore would be better off if it only had 2 large local banks. And so there were a lot of mergers, and we ended up with 3 local banks. In Hong Kong, you can find something like 20 banks. So it's much more competitive in Hong Kong than in Singapore. So the banks in Singapore, in a way, have an easier life because it's essentially a oligopoly.